Hi, I'm Mel,
And I'm Janelle.
and this is the Murder Mamas.
The Murder Mamas.
Welcome!
Welcome.
So, we are going to do part 2, and I think we're just going to jump right into it.
Go.
Okay.
Tell me the story.
Okay. So, I'm going to repeat what I said in the last episode. On the night of November 26, 1986, a 25-year-old sex worker named Josephine Riviera stood on a corner near the northeast corner scouting potential customers. A gleaming white Cadillac pulled up beside her. Gary was behind the wheel and he backed into her. Not like backed into her, but like backed up to her.
Okay. Yeah.
I don't mean like whirled or
reversed.
Yeah, reversed to see her. Gary complimented Josephine, telling her she looked like Diana Ross. He offered to pay $20 for her company and she joined him in the car. Gary drove to a nearby McDonald's and ordered a coffee. Then he asked Josephina if she'd like to come back to his place. Josephina usually didn't like going home with her clients. She would have preferred a brief encounter in his car, but she was a single mother to 3 children and she was desperate for the cash, so she agreed. When they got to his house on Marshall Street, she felt apprehensive. It was a strange place. Pennies were glued to the walls inside the kitchen, and $1 and $5 bills were plastered all over the walls, all the way up the stairs.
What?
Yeah. So he just had money taped to the walls everywhere, and pennies in his kitchen. Who the fuck knows? He's got all that stock from Merrill Lynch, so I don't know what he's doing.
I'm like, I know people can't see my face, but like mouth agape, like, huh?
Yeah, it's really weird. I wish they had a photograph of that, but I couldn't find one.
What a weird flex.
It's really,
look at all the
pennies.
Look at all the pennies I've put up in my kitchen.
Quarter.
Like, okay.
Yep.
I just like, whenever I hear these, whenever we do anything, I think about how the victim would feel.
Yeah.
And like, imagine being like, okay, like I really don't want to do this, but like I'll go back this one time. And then you walk in and it's just a house with a bunch of money on the walls. And you're like, what the fuck?
I'd start killing them all down.
Oh my God. I would run away.
Yeah. Despite this, she followed Gary to his bedroom. He paid her the $20 he'd promised. Then they got into...
$20?
For $20, yeah. Then they got into bed and had sex.
Ugh.
Afterwards, Gary got up to get dressed, and Josephina turned around to reach for her own clothes. But as she grabbed her jeans, she felt Gary's hands on her, wrapping her around the throat. Gary was throttling her then. Just as she was passing out, he let go. By the time she was able to understand what was going on, he had ordered her to stand up and put her hands behind her back. Terrified, Josephina obeyed. A moment later, she felt the cold metal pair of handcuffs lock around her wrist. Gary forced her down one set of stairs and then another all the way into the basement, where he guided her to an old, used mattress lying on the floor. Yep. He then reached into a nearby cardboard box and pulled out a pair of metal muffler clamps meant to fit around a car's exhaust pipe. Gary tightened the clamps and Josephine's ankles. Then he grabbed a metal chain and secured one end to the clamps, then looped the other around a pipe running along the ceiling.
Oh my God. This
Can
is
you
like a
imagine?
Movie nightmare shit.
Yeah. Fucking, yeah. Whew. Okay. Once she was securely restrained, he moved her to the center of the room. There was a spot there where he had torn up the concrete floor. And this, happened in his last house, and dug a pit out of the dirt below. Gary grabbed a shovel and began scooping up dirt, making the pit even larger. He talked to her as he dug, explaining that he wanted to have kids, and lots of them. He told her he tried starting a family before, but the state had intervened and removed the child from his custody. Gary was still fuming about the injustice. Even in her terror, Josephina could tell that Gary was an intensely lonely man. He wanted children to fill the void, telling Josephina that the world owed him these babies.
What?
Yeah. So.
The world doesn't owe you shit, man.
No. He said He intended to bring 10 women down to the basement, hold them captive, and impregnate each one of them, and they would all be one big happy family.
I don't think, like, maybe I'm naive, but I don't think that a happy family begins with
Kidnap?
being chained to a metal pole in a basement. Again, maybe I'm naive,
Mm-hmm.
but, like, I thought it was, like, true love.
Woo me, chain me.
Yeah, like, that is not a happy family, but
No.
okay.
Nope. He seemed thrilled by the idea of having a collection of human underlings to lord over a group of women and children who were totally dependent on him.
He's trying to start some fucking cult.
Yeah, he is.
Okay.
Gary displayed characteristics typical of abductors as he described his motivations to Josephina, a psychologist and Georgetown University professor. Dr. Feltens-Magon had compared predators like Gary to political dictators in an article touching on the subject of his book, The Psychology of Dictatorship. He described how certain men seek total power over individuals the same way dictators try to maintain powers over countries. He wrote the kidnapper is not satisfied with sexually attacking the victim. The kidnapper wants to be able to have complete control over them. So the kidnapper wants to be able to manipulate the victim 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It is the sense of absolute control that the kidnapper desires. Gary was obsessed with this kind of power. His basement was his own personal domain, and Josephina was his first subject. As soon as Gary went back upstairs, Josephina shuffled across the room as far as her chains would allow. She made it to one of the windows along the wall and, using a discarded pool cue she found on the floor, pushed it open. Then she launched her body halfway out, but the chain around her ankle held her tight. She couldn't go any further. She began to scream, hoping someone might hear her, but in Gary's high crime rate neighborhood, nobody gave a shit. The only person that responded was Gary. He rushed down to drag her all the way back into the basement and began to beat her until she cried that she couldn't take it anymore. Then he shoved her into the pit. It was barely big enough for Josephina to fit inside. She had to curl up with her neck bent and her legs folded against her chest. He covered the hole with a piece of plywood and placed bags of dirt on top of him to weigh it down.
No.
Just wait.
I don't want to.
Trapped underground, Josephina sobbed. Gary turned on the radio to drown out her cries. Then he went back upstairs. He was already making another plan to capture his next victim. 24-year-old Sandra, Jesus.
Sandora.
24-year-old Sandra Lindsay was an easy target because she already knew and trusted Gary. They met while Sandra was at the Alwyn Institute, a local nonprofit that serviced individuals with autism, intellectual, and developmental disabilities. Gary frequently hung around the institute to pick up women and bring them back home for sex.
I fucking hate this dude.
Yeah. After meeting Gary, Sandra attended sessions at the church he founded in 1971. She then agreed to sleep with him several times, although it's not clear she had the capacity to actually give consent.
Okay.
Gary had even gotten her pregnant, but she terminated the pregnancy on her own.
Good job.
Yeah. Soon afterwards, when he heard about the abortion, Gary offered her $1,000 to let him impregnate her again, but she declined. So he decided that if he couldn't bribe her into bearing his children, he'd force her to do it instead.
Smart girl.
Yeah. On November 29th, about 2 days after kidnapping Josephina, Gary found Sandra running errands at a corner store near her house. He coerced her to come home with him again. Once she was inside, he dragged her into the basement where Josephina was still trapped in the pit. He pulled Josephina out and resumed digging the hole he needed to make it large enough to fit 2 women. Afterward, he raped them both. When Sandra and Lindsay didn't return home that night, her family was worried. They began calling her friends, asking about her whereabouts. One suggested that he might be with Gary. So on the morning of November 30th, Sandra's sister and two of her cousins showed up at his house looking for her. Gary refused to answer the door, but he knew that they would be back unless he did something to, like, take away their suspicions.
Yeah, like...
Yeah. Later...
Cover his
track, yeah. Later that day, he brought a pen and paper into the basement and dictated a message for Sandra to write. Like...
What?
She wrote, "Dear Mom, do not worry. I will call in a while." She signed her name, then addressed the envelope. Gary then drove all the way to New York City, where he dropped it in the mailbox. He wanted Sandra's family to see the postmark and assumed she'd run away. But when Sandra's mother received the letter, she didn't believe Sandra had written of her own free will. It wasn't like her to leave on her own or to even leave the town that she was living in. So he's, like, taking steps to make sure that, like, he knows what he's doing, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
He's not mentally incapable of, like, he knows what he's doing. He's planning ahead.
For sure. All of this is so premeditated.
Yeah. Premeditated. Yeah, that's what I was looking for. I couldn't think of it.
And, like, here, let me, cover my tracks. Yeah. Write this letter.
Like, he thinks that's just gonna, like, oh, okay, well, she wrote a letter, so everything must be fine.
Couldn't he have driven himself to, like, I don't know, a different big city?
Who knows? I know. Yet Sandra's mother insisted that they look into Gary. Unfortunately, when the officer questioned Sandra's friend about Gary, the friend misspelled Gary's last name. When the officer eventually typed the name into the system, there were no results. So he gave the case less priority and made few follow-up efforts to search for Sandra. It's just like one thing after another. Like, why do these men or these perpetrators just keep getting away with these things? Like, they fly under the radar and they just keep getting released. It's insane to me.
And it's so upsetting because, like, looking back now, right? You're like, it's right there.
It's right there, yeah. In the meantime, Gary took extra steps to avoid getting caught. He started soundproofing his basement to ensure that no one would hear his captive's screams. He also beat both women relentlessly to discourage them from trying to run away. Weeks went by. Gary kept Sandra and Josephina shackled 24 hours a day. He didn't let them bathe or comb their hair. When nobody came to rescue the women, they became defeated, and Gary grew more confident. By December 22nd, 1986, he was ready for a new addition. That Monday, he cruised around the streets of Philadelphia in his Cadillac until he came upon a 19-year-old woman named Lisa Thomas. Lisa fit the profile of all Gary's victims. She was a young black woman with a low income. When she saw Gary's fancy car, she waved, which caught his attention. He pulled over and offered her a ride to wherever she was going. Impressed by the car, Lisa agreed. As they drove, Gary flirted with her. He flooded her with compliments and asked if she'd like to come to Atlantic City with him. When she replied that she had nothing to wear for such a trip, he drove her to Sears. Way back when.
Sears.
No longer.
Oh, Sears.
Handed her a $50 bill and told her to buy whatever she wanted. So Lisa was totally won over. She was like, fuck yeah, I hit the jackpot. After purchasing a few new outfits, she decided to go home with Gary. They went back to his house, and after he'd given her a glass of wine, she reportedly passed out due to the alcohol, which was a reaction with an allergy medication that she was taking. As she regained, I don't know, that's what they said, so it must have been a fucking heavy allergy pill.
Yeah.
As she regained her senses, Gary brought her to his room and had sex with her. But when she'd asked if he'd give her a ride to her friend's house, Gary snapped. He grabbed her by the throat and began to strangle her. She tried to fight him off, but he wouldn't let her go. Instead, he snapped a pair of handcuffs on her wrist and brought her down to the basement. Downstairs, Gary put Josephina and Sandra out of the pit where he'd left them, but before they were allowed to eat, he raped his new prisoner in front of both of them. For Lisa, the assault was a grim initiation into what would become a horrific daily routine, and there was no end in sight. Gary was eager to grow his family, and on New Year's Day, 1987, he went scouting again. He found 23-year-old Deborah Johnson Dudley and brought her home. A little over 2 weeks later, he met an 18-year-old sex worker named Jacqueline Askins. She went home with him, expecting a typical job. When she got there, he showed her some arcade games that he had collected, and she started playing with them. While she was distracted, he put her head in a headlock and dragged her into the basement. Gary was elated to now have 4 women under his control, but expressed his pleasure in increasingly depraved acts of cruelty. He beat the woman with a shovel handle, and sometimes he forced them to beat each other as well. Yeah. He didn't want the women to come together and rise up against him, so he tried to make them each resent each other. He did this by playing favorites, especially with Josefina Riviera, because she was the most compliant. She had worked out that obedience meant survival. She was the first one, and she has, there's a podcast that I listened to, just her survival story. She survives. And like she was saying, in her mind, she was trying to make out a way to like really get connected with him so that he would trust her. And she could tell that the other women were like resenting that, thinking that she was like trying to be his friend, but really she was trying to gain a way to like get out. So like they weren't placed like close enough to talk to each other, and he had music blaring all the time so nobody could hear his screams, so like they couldn't communicate well with each other. Like she couldn't say, hey, I'm doing this because I want to get out of here. So like they were like totally resenting her for a while, and she was like, it made me feel awful. Like even when they cooperated, it didn't stop Gary from punishing them. It was a compulsion he couldn't resist. In a 2012 study on sadism published in the International Journal of Offender Therapy and Comparative Criminology, researcher Jay Healy, Patrick Lucia, and Eric Bergarde conducted a study on sexual sadists, those who were sexually aroused by violent or humiliating behavior. The authors noted that among all types of rapists identified by researchers, sexual sadists might be one of the groups most likely to escalate their violence to homicide. While not all sexual sadists have violent impulses that end in murder, Gary's whole world seemed to revolve around degrading and torturing these women. It was clear that a deadly outcome was inevitable. In February, after more than 2 months of being held captive, 24-year-old Sandra Lindsay became ill. She was vomiting and feverish. Gary was pleased by this because he thought that her sickness might be a sign of pregnancy, but his mood soured when Sandra lost her appetite. Gary worried that his baby wasn't getting enough to eat, so he tried to force feed her some bread. When she refused, he became enraged to teach her a lesson. Gary hooked her to one of her chains to a beam on the ceiling. She hung there for at least 2 days, suspended by one wrist. Ow. I know, right? Eventually, it's possible that the weight of her own limp body squeezed the air out of her lungs and caused her to asphyxiate. So she died.
Wait.
Yeah.
She died hanging from the ceiling?
Yeah.
Because
she couldn't breathe.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Didn't you say that he hung the animals?
Mm-hmm. Yep. When Gary saw that Sandra had died, his reaction was cold, calculating. He felt no remorse about torturing the woman to death. All he cared about was getting rid of the body so that he wouldn't get caught. But he knew he had to be careful. Sandra's family had already shown up at his place looking for her. Despite his efforts to make it look like she'd run away to New York, Gary knew he might be the first suspect if Sandra were to be found dead, so he used an electric saw to dismember Sandra's body. Allegedly, he then ground up what body parts he could and fed them to his 2 dogs. He set aside her skull and tossed it in a pot of boiling water. Other parts he tried to incinerate in the oven as he roasted her body parts.
It is just so, like, that's a human.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, just
disassociation from just general human life.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's
I know it
insane.
happens, like, and we do this every week,
Oh, yeah.
but, like, it's still mind-blowing.
It is. Every time we talk about it, it is. The smell of burning flesh filled the house.
Ugh.
The women downstairs gagged from the stench. The smell was even noticeable from outside. Gary's neighbors had ignored some of his questionable behaviors before, but when they caught wind of the stomach-churning scent, they called the police.
Nice, finally.
And officers stopped by Gary's to investigate around 5 p.m. on February 10th. When questioned about the particular smell, Gary said that he had burnt a roast. He seemed calm.
I'm gonna stop you there.
Mhm.
I've burned food.
It does not
It
smell
happens
like
to all of us.
Mhm. It smells like burnt food.
It smells like a fire.
Yeah.
Like,
It doesn't smell like a dead body.
yeah.
No. Yeah. So he seemed calm and lucid, so the officers didn't see any reason to go inside and look around. Satisfied, they went on their way. Again.
Oh, fuck, man.
But Sandra's death and the police visit rattled Gary. Suddenly he worried his scheme was unraveling, and perhaps the woman sensed that he was becoming vulnerable. Deborah Dooley, the most rebellious of Gary's captives, helped devise an attack on Gary. She planned to hit Gary over the head with an iron pipe they had found buried in the dirt under the floor, and she wanted the others to attack him while he was stunned. However, the plan fell apart before Deborah could strike. Apparently, Josephina confessed to Gary, wanting to earn his trust in hopes that he might buy her freedom. When he found out, Gary gave out his most brutal punishment yet. He took screwdrivers and drove them into the woman's ears, piercing their eardrums.
I flipped Mel off, just FYI. That's
the one I was waiting for.
I could come up with. I fucking hate you. I hate that. You know how I feel about that.
He reasoned that if
it was literally like an impulse. Like, you said it, you turned, and just
fuck you.
Fuck you.
He reasoned that if they couldn't hear, it would be harder for them to devise any more schemes to overpower him. Only Josephina was spared. The more Gary inflicted pain on his prisoners, the more he seemed to enjoy it. As bad as the first few months of captivity were, the worst was still to come. Gary continued to beat and rape the women daily. He also taunted them with threats that he would grind up pieces of Sandra's body and mix it in with their food. Then, in March of 1987, he came up with a new method of torture. Gary cut the end off an electric extension cord and stripped the protective coating, leaving the wire bare. He began administering shocks to the women whenever it suited him. On Wednesday, March 18th, he decided they needed to be punished more severely. He ordered Deborah, Lisa, and Jacqueline to sit in the underground pit and use the hose to fill it with water. As the women sat shivering in the homemade pool, Gary prepared the extension cord. Either he or Josephina, under his instruction, pressed the live wire to the metal chains that restrained the women. The electric current ran through the metal and coursed through their bones or skin or whatever.
That is like one of the most fucked up things I think you
I don't know how you could do this to another person. I just don't understand. Moments later, 23-year-old Deborah went silent and limp. The other woman called out, "You've killed her." And when Gary peered into the pit, he saw Deborah slumped over. Her face was underwater. Gary pulled the woman out and laid Deborah's body across the floor. After confirming she was dead, he looked at the others and said, "Aren't you glad it wasn't one of you?" Gary made the most of Deborah's death. He saw it as an opportunity to tighten his control over his captives. He grabbed a pen and paper and told Josephina to write out a confession letter admitting her role in Deborah's death. He told her, "If you ever go to the cops, I can use this in evidence that you killed Debbie." And then he made the other woman sign this sheet as witnesses to the letter. So he was satisfied he could blackmail Josephina by this letter that she would never go, like, what?
It feels like he's never heard of anything called duress.
No.
Like, I'm just like,
well, you wrote the letter, so you must be guilty.
She wrote a letter, and my captors signed it. There was no stress or pressure or like, you know, power dynamics at play here. It was all voluntary.
Voluntary, totally. He was so certain now that she'd never defy him, he decided he could grant her a little more freedom. He removed Josephina's chains and gave her a clean shirt and a pair of jeans to wear and allowed her to go upstairs. Over the next few days, he gave Josephina a free rein of the house. He acted as if she were his girlfriend, confiding in her, ruminating on what he'd do if he were caught. As far as he was concerned, he and Josephina were accomplices, both responsible for Deborah's death. He truly believed that she couldn't go to the police without implicating herself, so he enlisted her help in getting rid of Deborah's body. Gary wrapped the corpse in a blanket and carried it out to his car and told Josephina to get in the passenger seat. She was afraid, but she knew the more Gary trusted her, the better chances of her staying alive were. Better, yeah. So she got in the car. Gary drove them about 40 miles east into the forest of New Jersey. He parked in a desolate spot in the middle of the Pine Barrens. Josephina watched over the car while Gary dumped Deborah's body among the trees, then returned to the vehicle. The following morning, Gary sought out a sex worker he'd hired in the past, 24-year-old Angus Adams. He paid her to perform oral sex on him the month before, but apparently Gary wasn't interested in kidnapping her at that point. But this time, he offered her $30 for an appointment, luring her to his home. He brought her into his room to have sex, but as she got ready to leave, he grabbed her by the neck, handcuffed her, and dragged her to the basement. In the aftermath of the attack, he felt confident he could repopulate his birthing scheme in no time. Meanwhile, Josephina had kept a close eye on Gary, ready to take advantage of his good mood. The next day, she asked if she could visit her family. By then, she had convinced him that she had no interest in running away. She told him that if he allowed her to leave for a few hours, she'd bring back a new woman for the basement.
Is he going to say yes?
Mm-hmm. Gary agreed. He still had her confession letter as an insurance, and he was convinced that he had cowered and manipulated her into submission, and it didn't occur to him that she could actually be tricking him.
Oh, man.
For being IQ of 130, he's not very smart. Once she was out of Gary's sight, Josephina raced to the apartment of an old boyfriend, Vincent. As soon as he opened the door, Josephina opened her mouth and her story came spilling out. She told him everything. Hearing the tale of her rape and torture, Vincent was ready to grab a weapon and go look for Gary himself. But Josephina convinced him to call the police. They called 911 from a payphone. Moments later, 2 police came to meet them. Josephina repeated her story to the officers. She told him that 3 other women were still in captivity, and she was terrified Gary would kill them if she didn't return. The officers stared at her in disbelief. The accusations seemed too grotesque to be true. But when Josephine showed them the marks on her arms and wrists, scars left by the prolonged use of handcuffs and chains, they finally agreed to investigate. Josephina had told the police where Gary would be waiting to pick her up at midnight, and the police agreed to check it out when they arrived at the gas station. Gary was sitting in his Cadillac. The officers drew their guns, approached the car, and asked Gary to step outside. Gary raised his hands and exited the car. Despite the guns pointed at him, he didn't seem worried. He asked them if they were coming to hassle him about the child support he owed his estranged wife. Then Josephina stepped forward. According to one of the officers at the scene, she pointed to Gary and cried, "That's him. He raped me and killed 2 other girls." The officer placed Gary under arrest and took him into custody. Meanwhile, more officers arrived to take Josephina's statement. While retelling her story, Josephina grew increasingly agitated, asking if anyone was going back to the house for the other women. She asked them again and again, growing frantic. It was another 4 hours before police were finally given the command to search Gary's house. Around 5 a.m. that morning, police surrounded Gary's home on North Marshall Street. They broke the front door down with a crowbar and stampeded into the house. Immediately, the smell of death hung in the air, and the television and radio were blaring. The thermostat was also set to a blistering high temperature altogether.
Oh. Why?
As the police trampled through the kitchen, one of the officers spotted fragments of what could have been human bones in a roasting pan. They went downstairs to find Lisa Thomas and Jacqueline Askins chained to the wall. The two were fast asleep. They jerked awake as the officers surrounded them for a moment. They were too bewildered to understand that they were being rescued. When the realization hit, they began crying. They pointed to the pit in the middle of the room, covered in plywood and weighed down with sandbags. When police peered inside, they found Angus Adams. Angus was terrified, but still fairly healthy. She had only been trapped a couple of days, but the other two women looked shockingly malnourished because they had been there for a lot longer.
Yeah.
Their wrists and ankles were covered in sores and abrasions. After freeing them with bolt cutters, the authorities transported them to the hospital. Their agonizing ordeal was finally over, but that couldn't change the fate of Sandra Lindsay and Deborah Dooley. Sandra's mother was devastated to learn that her suspicions were correct. All along, she had pushed police to investigate Gary, but they had essentially dropped the matter. Her mother told reporters they could have saved them all. The authorities were certainly paying attention now. After finding Sandra Lindsay's remains, they went looking for more bodies. They couldn't discount the possibility that Gary had been killing for years. Over the next few days, they thoroughly searched Gary's apartment on North Marshall Street, bringing in backhoes to excavate his yard. They conducted a similar search of the house on Cedar Avenue where Gary had lived previously. As authorities pored over Gary's life with a fine-tuned comb, Gary himself remained locked up in Philadelphia Detention Center without bail. He was attacked by another prisoner shortly after he was detained, so for his own safety, he was transferred to the psychiatric unit of the penitentiary.
Did they find anything at the old house?
No. A little over a week after his arrest, he tried to hang himself in the bathroom using his shirt.
Yeah. I was going to say something, but I'm going to choose to watch my words.
Okay. Guards rescued him before it was too late, which meant Gary was alive to stand trial for capital murder. But lawyers had to contend with another major obstacle, the question of Gary's mental illness. A few days after his suicide attempt, Gary hired a defense lawyer, Charles Pareto Jr. The lawyer wasted no time laying the groundwork for an insanity defense for his client. He even started describing Gary as insane to the press. Gary's demeanor added to this image. Reporters noticed and commented on his distinctive way of dressing in court appearances. Gary often styled himself in the same outfit again and again, a dirty buckskin jacket with fringe and an old Hawaiian shirt. During these appearances, he often appeared vacant. He even drooled on occasion, though this was perhaps because he had been prescribed large doses of Thorazine, a medication used to treat psychotic disorders while in custody. Prosecutors could only hope that Gary's odd behavior wouldn't sway a jury. If Gary were declared insane, he would likely spend the rest of his life in a psychiatric hospital. But that wasn't good enough for the district's attorney office. They wanted the death penalty. Gary's notoriety was also challenged for the trial. The grisly details of the crime dominated the airwaves for days. Predictably, the media seized upon shocking details of Gary's horrific acts, his eccentric behavior, his secret market riches, and the disturbing racial implications of a white man holding vulnerable black women captive. Mm-hmm. Taking all this in, Gary's defense attorney argued that it would be impossible to select an impartial jury. He said that the sensationalized media coverage had already made the public against his client. So as the trial date drew near, the judge in case approved the defense's request to select an out-of-town jury. They chose from a pool from Pittsburgh to be transported to Philadelphia for the trial in June of 1988. Then the trial began. Charles Pareto Jr., his lawyer, made no attempt to deny that Gary had tortured and killed his captives. but he argued that Gary couldn't be held responsibility for the murders. He had called on several psychiatrists to testify to this effect. They discussed Gary's long history of schizophrenia and mental illness and testified that Gary was suffering from delusions that made it impossible for him to control his actions. The prosecution, relying on their own mental health experts, agreed that Gary was undeniably mentally ill. However, they said he didn't meet the legal definition of insanity because he knew that what he had done was wrong. Otherwise, he wouldn't have gone to such great length to cover up his crimes.
That's what I was going to say. Like,
yep. Yeah.
The thought he put into it is...
Yeah. For example, he made calculated efforts to soundproof the basement so that nobody could hear his prisoners. He attempted to throw police officers off by sending Sandra Lindsay's letters from New York, and he made sure to hide the bodies of his victims to avoid detection. Whatever delusions Gary's experienced, his actions demonstrated he was fully aware that he was breaking the law. Testimony dragged on for nearly 2 weeks, but at the beginning of July 1988, the jury returned a verdict. They found Gary guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and rape. After everything,
Finally.
I know, right? After everything the victims and their families had been through, they were relieved but surprised to see justice prevail, especially since it required a Caucasian jury to sentence a Caucasian man to death. Gary didn't want to appeal his conviction, but he made another suicide attempt. In January 1989, around 3 a.m. one morning, death row guards discovered him unconscious in his cell, and he had been hoarding his prescribed medication tranquilizers and tried to use them to overdose. This suicide attempt left him in a coma for 2 days, and he was placed under constant suicide watch. After he regained consciousness, guards supervised him around the clock and checked his mouth to make sure he swallowed his pills. But Gary was determined to die, so he filed...
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you, but like, he shouldn't be sentenced to death. No. He should get life in prison.
Life, for sure.
He deserves
that's the easy way out.
Suffer every fucking day with no freedom, no wealth, no pennies on his wall, just... fucking a cell and solitude confinement and be grateful that he's not chained up.
Right.
Or put in a fucking hole in the ground with it.
Or electrocuted, So he filed a petition to speed up his execution. Pennsylvania death penalty cases are subject to automatic appeals, meaning the process can often drag on for years. But Gary wasn't interested in delaying the inevitable. What?
Inevitable.
I can't say that word.
Anemone.
Nah. He wanted to be executed as soon as possible. The court rejected his request to speed up his execution after Gary's petition was denied. One good thing. His case took 8 years to proceed through the court system, but his automatic appeals were finally exhausted. His execution was scheduled for April of 1997. However, as this date approached, there was another delay from an unlikely source. Gary's now 19-year-old daughter, Maxine, had never met her father, and because she was removed from his custody as an infant, and the thought of letting him die without seeing her was like a horrible thing. So like she wanted to see her father. She argued that Gary wasn't competent enough to be executed and filed a lawsuit on his behalf, requesting a last-minute reprieve of 2 or more years of legal battles. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court unanimously upheld Gary's sentence. 55-year-old Gary Heidnik died by lethal injection on July 6th, 1999.
How long was he in jail?
Well, they got him in the late 80s, and then he died in 99. So, not enough time.
What a fucked up dude, man.
Yeah, he's a horrible dude. Pretty bad.
Like,
I didn't know much about that. I don't know where I found that.
I don't know why, but his name seems familiar.
Yeah, its story does seem familiar.
It seems vaguely familiar, but not enough to be like...
Yeah.
I recognize this 100%.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like I've heard this before, but maybe it was a different name.
It could have been.
Like, how many people am I hearing about?
There's a lot of people that do this. Yeah.
Like,
shit. Yeah, it's pretty bad.
He was awful.
He was awful.
I hated that.
But he's dead now, so peace out.
I wish that he was suffering.
Yeah, I wish he would have suffered
because they gave him
longer.
what he wanted.
Yeah.
And I don't think he deserved that.
I don't think so either.
He deserved to
suffer.
Rot forever.
Yeah. In solitary confinement.
Also good on Josephina.
Yeah.
For so she, really playing the long game there.
She did that, and it was because of her that they were all rescued. And then she had said in the podcast that I listened to that the girls never spoke to each other again. Like, they saw each other at court, but they never got up the courage to talk. And, like, they've just drifted apart. And
I'm not sure that I would want to talk to someone that I was, like, trapped with.
Right. You're just bringing back
that trauma. Mm-hmm. I think I would just have to, like, sort that on my own journey.
Yeah.
And I don't know that being in a community setting would be helpful for me. Personally.
I totally agree. I just think it sucks because she had, like, mentioned it. She was, like, wanting to, like, express that she was sorry, and they did not even make eye contact with her, like, in the court. Like, it was just all...
I find that strange. Like, were they not grateful?
I think they were. They just couldn't bring themselves to...
Well, and maybe they're having to deal with, like, the complicated feelings of, like, resenting her.
Yeah.
When, like, she was just playing the long game, you know?
And then they had mental disabilities as well, so it's like, you know, who knows what they were thinking.
Yeah.
That's got to be so hard. So, that's it for that one. Thanks for listening. You can find us on Instagram at
The Murder Mamas,
Facebook,
The M Mamas,
Twitter,
The Murder Mamas,
email,
themurdermamas@gmail.com.
And if you like us and are happy with our content, please leave us a review and a 5-star rating. We would appreciate it. Bye.